IB students. All right, so today we are going to continue with 10.3 and we are going to look at types of selection. So the application here is to identify examples of directional, stabilizing, and disruptive selection. So let's define again what natural selection is. And remember, natural selection is change over time based on a particular environmental pressure. But remember that I told you that in order to be more specific with our definition, we were going to define natural selection as the change in the composition of a gene pool, or all the available genes and alleles available in that population. So the frequency of one particular phenotype in relation to another is going to be a product of the type of natural selection that occurs. And there are three types of natural selection processes. So let's start with the first one. The first one is stabilizing selection. And in stabilizing selection, we see that an intermediate phenotype is favored. That means that any extreme phenotype is going to be removed. And this happens in the environment when the conditions are stable and competition is low. So an example of this would be human birth weights. So we know that babies are born somewhere between 6.5 to 7.5 pounds. And that's because if they're too large, that's going to complicate the birthing process. And if they're too small, that's going to risk the infant. And of course, that is going to reduce the biological fitness of the Homo sapiens species. So that's one good example of stabilizing selection. And we see it here represented in the form of a graph. So here we see a normal distribution of phenotype fur color of mice. So in a normal distribution, we see that it follows a bell-shaped Gaussian trend. And in a stabilizing selection type of process, you're going to see that there's a favor towards that middle type of phenotype, right? So it's going to narrow those extreme phenotypes. Another example of stabilizing selection is here with robins and how they typically lay 4 eggs. And that's a form of stabilizing selection because if they lay too many eggs, that's going to mean malnourished chicks. And if they lay fewer eggs, that means that the might result in some of the offspring not being viable, and therefore that's going to decrease the biological fitness of that species. All right, so the second type of selection is directional selection, and this is where you favor one phenotypic extreme at the cost of the other phenotypic extreme. So you are shifting your phenotypic distribution in one direction towards that beneficial extreme. And this operates gradually over sustained changes in the environment. Eventually, after there's been directional selection, you might be followed by stabilizing selection as that one phenotype becomes the norm. So the one example that they give you here of directional selection is the development of antibiotic resistance in bacterial population. So we would see that in this graph here, right? So let's say that this is the norm for the bacterial population, but then one extreme of the bacterial population becomes resistant to antibiotics. So that's the phenotype that gets favored, okay? In the example here, we see a directional selection of the moths, what happened after the Industrial Revolution. As you saw, a shift from the light color moths to the darker color moths in 19th century England as the environment became more sooty. So that's one type of shift or directional selection favoring this phenotype right here. But when you think of the moths, you can also think of them as in terms of diversifying selection. If you happen to have both populations living in an environment that has both clean and sooty regions, and we'll talk about that in just a sec. So the last type of example is disruptive selection, where you see both phenotypic extremes favored at the expense of the intermediate. So as you see here in this graph, you see the extremes favored here and here, and you see the intermediate not being favored. So in this particular example, this arises as a result of a fluctuating environment. It could be seasons, for example, or it could be some type of event that has led to those two types of phenotypes being preferred. Now, if these phenotypes continue to separate over time, that might lead to speciation, which is the rise of new species. So the proliferation of black and white moths could also be an example of disruptive selection if you happen to have the moths living at the same time in a particular environment that has both types of environments, right? That would select for the black or the white moths. The example here that I particularly like, and this is based on also the environment, is the hypothetical population of the gray and Himalayan, which are the gray and white rabbits. And depending on where they live, right, they might be better camouflaged, or they might be better to blend with certain environments if they are gray or gray and white rather than just being white. So this will result in a diversifying selection where both extremes are favored. Okay, so yeah, so these are the 3 types of selection, and that is it for today.